It is the Banner Ravens podcast. Paul Mancano and Jonas Shaffer live on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Listening to it after the fact on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Please give us a thumbs up, a subscribe, a good review. We'll read it out here on the podcast. We got a lot to talk about here on today's show, Jonas. We're going to be revealing our plans for the offseason, dueling plans that we hope Eric DeCosta is listening to so that he can execute with perfection to produce the perfect Ravens offseason. But first, Jonas, the quite close to breaking news, I think you could say, developing story. This just in. That would be Justin Madubuike receiving the franchise tag from the Baltimore Ravens on the final day of the window being open. And that is the first major move of the Ravens offseason, as their defensive tackle will be around for at least one more year, barring a trade.
Before we dig into the nitty-gritty of this, Paul, did you mean this just in to be a Madubuike pun?
No, but it works perfectly.
We should. All right, we have the name for our podcast. This just in. No, I mean this was predictable even before John, even before Eric DeCosta, told the folks down in Indy last week, literally probably 7 days ago at this point, that it was probably going to be a tag situation for Madubuike if they couldn't get a deal done. This was something that we expected because for as much as you and I both like Patrick Queen, as much as big a hit as $22 million on that salary cap is, you can't afford to lose a guy like this. That there's always the possibility that they can work out a deal with him. Eric DeCosta saying in the statement today that they were unable to agree on extension, but that Justin is a great player and person, and we will continue to negotiate a long-term deal with him. They have until July 15th to get that deal done. If they don't get the deal done, they can still wait until after the year, that period from January/February to next March to work on that extension. I imagine that price will have only gone up, even if Madubuike does not deliver another 10-plus sack season. But this is about what we expected, and now it's just all about putting the pieces around Madubuike in a way that makes sense and optimizes the remaining Ravens cap space.
Yeah, the Pro Football Focus projection for Madubuike's contract, should he have hit free agency, and he could still get this, like you said, in an extension from the Ravens, but 4 years, $92 million. That's quite a lot of money to be handing somebody. And yes, it would have certainly helped the Ravens comp pick formula if he had hit the free agent market and signed with another team. But for all of the young, exciting talent that they have at defensive tackle going forward, they don't have a key piece. And especially when you're set to potentially lose, 2 9.5 sack guys on the edges and Kyle Van Noy and Jadeveon Clowney, you need as much pass rush, as much sack production as you can get. So at least buying themselves some time here to work out a long-term extension or having him under contract for one more season gives the Ravens just a little bit of security at that defensive line spot. Doesn't mean they can't address it as they get into free agency in the draft.
Yeah, and it will be interesting to see if there is any kind of acceleration in talks over this next week or so, because I think probably the best analog for Madubuike in free agency is not Chris Jones, because Chris Jones is in a level unto himself. I think the PFF projection had him as like a $30 million a year guy, but it's Christian Wilkins, another guy coming from Miami, a victim of the salary cap situation there, more pedigree than Madubuike in terms of where he went in the draft a few years back, but he is probably right at that Madubuike level in terms of what he would fetch on the open market, and that's the job of Justin Madubuike's agent. It's to judge without having your guy actually go to a free and open market, saying that this is what he would have gotten. And now that he has someone to point to in Christian Wilkins, who's going to be a free agent and who's going to command a lot of money. Is it 20? Is it closer to 25 million? Is it closer to 30 million? If Eric DeCosta believes it is, then that's probably more of a push to get a deal done that's like closer to 23, 24. Even if maybe you're unwilling to pay it now, you could be even more unwilling to pay that extra $5-6 million a year premium to keep an interior defensive lineman as good as Madubuike, Wilkins, etc.
It's a very similar situation to the Lamar Jackson situation last year,
exactly.
in that
Jalen Hurts.
Yeah, the Ravens placed the franchise tag on Lamar Jackson to give themselves a little bit more time, and before that July deadline, the Eagles extend Jalen Hurts for a massive 230 some $1 million deal, and that gave the Ravens kind of a framework and a structure to go out and sign Lamar Jackson to a number that was higher than that because of his pedigree and because of everything that he means to that franchise. But it's a similar situation where you just need an example of what somebody in the same ilk can fetch in the free agent market. All right, Jonas, we have constructed our off-season plans. You wrote about yours on the Baltimore Banner, where you can subscribe $1 for 6 months. We wrote about You wrote about what you would do with this Ravens offseason if you were Eric DeCosta. And let me tell you, Jonas, boy, if you like 2025 compensatory picks in rounds 3 through 5, this is the offseason for you. The Ravens are not going to be big spenders. They stand to lose a lot of their own free agents here, but there are moves around the margins that they could make to improve their team and try to get over the hump. Jonas, let's start with the contract restructures that you went for on in your article. $255 million is the salary cap. The Ravens are projected to have about 244 million, according to the
And that was before Madubuike today.
before Madubuike, who's getting $22.1 million on that franchise tag. How would you move money around in order to help the Ravens clear up a little bit more space this offseason?
The thing to remember with all this is you are not just having to be cap compliant by the start of the league year next year, but you're also having to make sure that you have that little pool of money for your draft class, for your practice squad, for your injury replacements, for your rainy day fund during the season. That is, according to Brian McFarland, who obviously does great work on this with the salary cap analysis for Russell Street Report, that could be anywhere from $14 million to $16 million. Obviously, if the Ravens offload a couple of their draft picks, especially in the middle rounds to, like, let's say next year, then that brings down what you have to spend. But so the salary cap target is not the 255 million; it's closer to 240 million. So that makes it even tougher, and that makes it even more important that the Ravens did get that extra $10 million bump in the salary cap, because, man, it's tough to imagine like a way forward that is not just nails on a chalkboard, irritating for Ravens officials to make all this work, because as we're about to show you, this is a lot of work to even get it into compliance, and that's with a $255 million salary cap. Imagine what it would have been with 245. So the easiest ways for the Ravens to make some space is something that they're probably going to have to do even more, we think, in the years upcoming, which is these restructuring of contracts. They can clear about $40 million in space by restructuring contracts. What you do when you restructure a contract is you convert much of the base salary in a player's, year, like for 2024, for instance, and then convert that into a prorated bonus. So you spread that money over the length of the contract. Of course, that money comes back around, and you do not want to find yourself in a situation like the Saints have, where you are, you know, restructuring contracts of bad players like a Derek Carr, just so that you can get cap compliant each and every year. I think for this year, it makes the most sense to do it with Lamar, because we think that he'll probably get a third contract eventually, and you can kind of shuffle money down further down the road at that point. That's $11.1 billion in possible cap space. Mark Andrews is about $5 million. Roquan Smith is about $3.7 million. You put all that together, that's an easy $20 million in cap space. Again, you're going to have to pay the piper at some point, but for this year at least, it helps the Ravens do what they need to be in a position to have a little bit more wiggle room. The less certain and the more dicey, uncertain piece of this is the Ronnie Stanley piece of it all. It's, the sensible, I think for Ronnie Stanley is to take a pay cut, but that's not an easy thing to do. We don't know how he feels about how he would fare on the open market. We don't know how his agent would feel on the open market. You look at previous examples of guys who have taken pay cuts. It is not super substantial. it's really hard to find guys who have taken more than $5 or $6 million off their salary in a given year, and none of them, I think, have been, or very few of them have been, as high profile a guy as Ronnie Stanley, who was only a couple of years an All Pro. Even last year was a really productive pass blocker. Gave up, I think, 1 or 2 sacks all year. But the facts are the facts. If they cut him, they would save just $8.3 million in cap space and leave $17.8 million in dead money charges. If you designate him as a post June 1st release, you save that cap space, but you don't get the full weight of that $15 million in cap space until after June 1st. So you only really get 50% of that relief for that first wave, which is when you would really need that kind of money to get a premium level upgrade at that spot. And I just don't see a whole lot of guys who are heading free agency as of right now who make a whole lot of sense. Tyron Smith is old and missed a lot of games. Trent Brown is old and has missed a lot of games. Mekhi Becton, injury prone. Jonah Williams could cost $15 million a year. We don't know that left tackle is even his best position. So it's a real dicey situation for that. I think that's probably the Jenga piece of this whole Ravens playoff or offseason picture that is the most uncertain, because we just don't know how the Ravens feel about Ronnie. We don't know how Ronnie feels about the Ravens and free agency. But let's just say in this case, it's a $6 million pay cut. They offer him, bonuses and incentives to get back to his old form. And that wouldn't take effect until the 2025 cap. Designate Odell Beckham Jr. with a post-June 1 release. That's $1 million in savings as opposed to $7 million in dead money if it's just a typical pre-June 1st release. So that is something that was worked out with Odell. That was a good thing for the Ravens. They have until I think midweek next week or later next week to possibly get an extension done with him. But obviously that would cut into their space unless it was a very void year heavy type deal. Probably the easiest part in terms of personnel decisions for the Ravens is cutting Tyus Bowser. Just has not played a whole lot these past 2 years. Did not really show any signs of getting that knee back into playing shape at any point this offseason. I mean, as far back as late October, I think it was, John Harbaugh was saying that he was optimistic that Tyus Bowser could potentially make a return to the field. That did not happen. At no point was he even designated to return to the Ravens. So you cut him, that's an easy $5.5 million on savings. And then you have to get a little bit creative. Do you work out a deal with Patrick McCarry to keep him through next year, through the 2025 year? That could reduce his cap hit this year. Do you add void years to a guy like Patrick Ricard, who's entering the last year of his deal and has been useful and would continue to remain useful, I think, to the Ravens, but played his fewest snaps in a few years under Todd Monken, played his lowest snap share under Todd Monken in a few years. How much usefulness is there for him? You could cut him, get that obvious cap relief. I think it would be about $4 million. Don't have that number handy, but that leaves you with another hole. Do you have a reliable inline blocker that Patrick Ricard is to kind of fill that fill that spot? We know Todd Monken likes to have guys who can block capably along the edges. Having Ricard was such a bonus for the Ravens in their play action game, in their normal drop back passing game. Even if he wasn't a huge bonus in the run, it's hard for me to imagine the Ravens cutting ways with him a year early. But this is tough because there are going to be some really tough calls, some really tough negotiations to make this offseason as we get closer to the start of the league year next week.
That's a lot of business to get done before they even approach free agency. Jonas, take a sip of water after going through all of those moves. I agree completely with a lot of those, and much more about the cap machinations than I do, but they make sense to me. I mean, you're not going to part ways with Ronnie Stanley just for the cap savings because, like you said, there's no available upgrade that makes a whole lot of sense. And that doesn't mean keeping him for next year doesn't mean you can't draft behind him and have a plan to fill that spot eventually.
And we didn't even talk about Morgan Moses either. That's $5.5 million in cap space, but if you're paying $6 or $7 million for a guy who I think could be again an above average pass protector, that's surplus value. You're not going to find a you're not going to find a guy who's as good a fit, I think, for the Ravens offense as Morgan Moses at $7 million on the open market, unless you just get really, really lucky with your projections.
And OBJ, little too little production, and he's getting into his 30s now. For what he could cost, I think you'd rather turn to a draft that is full of quality wide receivers in rounds 2, 3, 4. Releasing Tyus Bowser, of course, missing the entire season on the NFI list makes sense to me. And then Ricard and Macari, completely agree, though those are kind of lower leverage moves and lower impact moves. All right, let's turn our attention towards free agency. Obviously the Ravens stand to lose some guys. They stand to lose, some guys like Patrick Queen. They could, lose a lot of their cornerback depth in Arthur Mollett. They could lose Jadeveon Clowney. Who could they get in free agency that you think would make sense for the Ravens?
It's a very limiting pool because with Madubuike getting that tag, he is their big ticket expenditure. I mean, that's how Ravens fans have to think about it. It's a little bit different because typically, they get these deals done with these guys during the season or maybe earlier in the offseason, and it doesn't really register as a free agent signing. But in this case, that's how you have to think about it. You're paying Justin Madubuike a whole heck of a lot of money to be on this team next year, just like you would any of the number of guys who Ravens fans might want on this roster for next year. Obviously, there are a lot of pie in the sky dreams about maybe bringing Mike Evans to Baltimore. That's not going to happen because he just re-signed with the Bucks. But I think with our cap math, with us keeping Ronnie Stanley, keeping Morgan Moses, you probably can't spend more than, I don't know, like $6, $7, $8 million on like a significant guy that you're bringing into this roster. It's tough for me to see where it makes sense to really spend big money on a big name, especially considering the implications of just again with the comp pick stuff. If you were spending money on a guy who has reached the end of his contract, then you're probably negating a Jadeveon Clowney deal for like a third or fourth round comp pick, a Geno Stone, comp pick for a fourth or fifth round pick. I mean, you have to be very considerate of not just how much you're spending, but also the type of player that you're spending it on.
So who would make sense?
For me, I don't know if I personally would be spending money on a running back, but I think that's probably where we're headed. That there were the reports last offseason about the Ravens being in the mix for Josh Jacobs, for Derrick Henry. We know, as recently as 2019, Eric DeCosta, knowing how impressive that running game was about to be with Lamar Jackson set to take off, gave Mark Ingram a nice deal, 3 years, $15 million. I think someone like Tony Pollard is, for me, probably the sweet spot of value and contract. I think you would probably get the most out of a guy like that without having to pay the premium for a name like Saquon Barkley or Josh Jacobs or Derrick Henry. I think you look at just what he's done over his career. It's kind of interesting because he has played behind a very good Dallas offensive line. He's played with a dual threat in Dak Prescott. He would be coming to Baltimore to play behind what we think could be at least a solid offensive line, and obviously the ultimate running back PED in Lamar Jackson. But you just look at what the Ravens kind of need. I think you need a guy who is that one, like that RB1, 1.5, 2. As you kind of put it last week, Paul, like 1.5, 2.5. There's not really a workhorse running back nowadays in the NFL. Certainly not with the Ravens, considering just how they like to kind of disperse those snaps. But he has been a guy who can pass protect. He can be a capable receiver. I think he's been over 300 yards several times in his career, including the last few years, I believe. Rushing yards over expectation, a stat that I really like. He was over expectation in the first 4 years of his career, Last year was the first time that he was under expectation, but you look at what he did in the second half of last season compared to the first half of last season when he was maybe still working off some of that rust from the high ankle sprain, from the broken fibula, I think that he dealt with in the playoffs with the Cowboys. He was a lot better in the backstretch than he was in the front stretch. So I think all that together, if you can get him on a deal that's like $6 million, $7 million a year, you can still have that first year cap hit be like $4 or $5 million a year. Maybe you don't have to offer him a whole lot of guaranteed money to come to Baltimore because he believes in himself that he can get to that second year and earn that amount without needing to be sent back to the free agent hustle bustle again. I just think it would make a lot of sense for what the Ravens need, especially considering, we don't know what Keaton Mitchell's deal is. We don't know, how Justice Hill would fare as a running back 1.5. And even if the Ravens draft a running back, Paul, I think this is probably the most interesting thing I found. Without taking a look at the outline, do you want to guess how many times a rookie running back under John Harbaugh has gotten at least 10 carries in a game through the first 10 weeks of the season?
Averaging 10 carries a game?
No, just 10 carries in a game.
In a single game.
In the entire John Harbaugh era for a rookie from week 1 to week 10.
3.
So it's happened just 8 times, I believe.
That was good. Okay.
It's surprising.
I guessed especially low because of how you tossed it.
Yeah, but like you think about all the good running backs who have been in Baltimore as rookies. Like it only happened twice with Ray Rice. It only happened twice with J.K. Dobbins. It might have happened more than the one time it did with Gus Edwards, but obviously he basically kind of rose in prominence when Lamar did. But you think back to J.K. As soon as he got going in the second half of that rookie year, he really took off. But wasn't it a little strange in retrospect that the Ravens were not giving him the rock, early in his rookie year and just not trusting him to do the things that he was so plainly, obviously capable of doing in the second half of that year? It just might be that there is that kind of curve that these running backs have to get over to get out of John Harbaugh's doghouse as a rookie. And I think you have to take that into consideration when you are assembling what that first half of 2024 running back depth chart might look like.
Yeah, so I think Tony Pollard is near the top half of that second tier of running backs, of free agent running backs, because I think the first tier is really Saquon Barkley, Josh Jacobs, Derrick Henry. And then I think it gets into that second tier with like Tony Pollard and Austin Eckler and DeAndre Swift and Devin Singletary. I like that idea of the signing. I just don't know if I'm willing to commit as much as, like you said, $7 million. I think the key thing here is going to be giving a free agent running back a 1-year deal, because you have Keaton Mitchell, at least maybe not fully healthy for this entire season, but if he can get back towards his regular self near the end of the 2024 season, he could be your RB1 in 2025. I have them addressing the running back position both in free agency and in the draft, which I think is possible. The guy that I have them going after in free agency at the running back position would be Dante Foreman, because I think that he did very well for the Bears last year, at least in the first half of the year. And I think he will be cheaper than Tony Pollard. I have him signing with the Ravens on a 1-year, about $3 million deal. He signed for the Bears last year on a 1-year, $2 million $2 million deal, I should say. He's 6 foot, 235 pounds. So he's a little bit of that bigger back that Gus Edwards was for them this past year. Chicago kind of turned to a younger group at running back near the end of the year, and he was a healthy scratch. They went with Khalil Herbert. So Foreman who's 28, going to be 28 this season, was kind of out of the picture at this point, but he makes sense to me as a 1-year stopgap guy who won't cost as much. And then I have them also addressing running back in the draft, so that they address it 2 different ways, but they're not left totally bereft of veteran presence at the running back position. And then I have them taking a couple other guys in free agency on 1-year deals who I think could improve their rushing attack and their passing attack. And that would be guards John Feliciano on a 1-year, $2 million deal, and Greg Van Roten on a 1-year, $2.75 million deal. Feliciano, both of these guys are old. I'll just go ahead and say it. That's how you're able to get them on 1-year deals. And both of those numbers are taken directly from the Pro Football Focus projections. But they are, near the end of their careers. They have struggled with injuries the last couple of years. Feliciano's 32, going to be 32. Van Roten is going to be 34. But they're PFF's number 5, and number 7 ranked guards in 2023, respectively. So they are still producing pretty darn well at this point in their careers. And I just think when you're talking about potentially losing John Simpson and Kevin Zeitler in free agency, both of those guys expected to sign deals of at least $10 million in free agency. And Jonas, I don't think, do you have the Ravens bringing back either John Simpson or Kevin Zeitler in free agency?
Nope.
See, that concerns me just because, and I know you have Ben Cleveland. I know you have Saleh. I know you can address guard in the draft. And I know guard is far less important than tackle on the offensive line, but I would like some kind of veteran presence there. So if they can bring in one of those guys that I mentioned, Feliciano, Van Roten, on cheap 1-year deals, I think you can have a stopgap there while you address the interior offensive line in the draft as well to kind of backfill those positions.
Yeah, and it looks like Van Roten has been not a every game starter over the past
Right.
couple of years. He's been an every game player for the most part. 17 games in 2021, 16 in 2022, 17 games in 2023, which is the first time he started more than 16 games in his career. Feliciano, I believe, was 16 games in 2022, 17 games last year. So obviously, the closer you get to age 35 to age 40, the more you have that risk of breaking down. I mean, we saw Kevin Zeitler, we saw Morgan Moses, two Ironmen who came into Baltimore with that Ironman reputation, but things happened and they start to get a little bit gimpy, get a little bit limpy, get banged up in ways that players who play in the trenches typically do. So it's obviously a risk to spend significant capital on those guys who are over the hill at age 30, so to speak. But that could be an area where the Ravens find value. Obviously they were able to bring the most out of Kevin Zeitler's talent when they signed him, and when they signed him, he wasn't an especially young player. So that may be where the Ravens look. There may be other names who become available. If not over this next week, then over the next couple months. So obviously, Morgan Moses, I think, was a guy who, before he signed with the Ravens, would have been a guy that they probably would have liked to have, because he came, he had that really nice year, I think, with the Jets, or really nice 2 years with the Jets, because he became available so late in free agency that there weren't a whole lot of teams that had the money to pay for him. So his market got kind of depressed. And I think that's something that we have to consider. The Ravens probably will not spend their entire war chest this offseason in the first couple of weeks of free agency, because they like having that money to sign a Jadeveon Clowney or a Kyle Van Noy or a Mollett or Ronald Darby, because they know that there can be value there if you are willing to be patient.
Speaking of those names, you mentioned in your article guys that could be coming back either at the first, second, or later the third, fourth, fifth waves of free agency. Maybe there are a lot of guys that wait out and you wait for them they can't get a better deal elsewhere. But there are a lot of guys that the Ravens could bring back as depth pieces on like short-term, 1 year, $2 to $3 to $4 million deals. Malik Harrison was one linebacker. Ronald Darby, cornerback, was great for them this past year, had a nice bounce back year. Arthur Mollett, I think, would be a nice addition if they could keep him because of his ability to blitz off the edge, his ability to, be a ball hawk in the middle of the field. Delshon Phillips, I think, makes a lot of sense for more linebacker depth. And then we talked about last week, Kyle Van Noy, only projected by Pro Football Focus to get $3.3 million. If that deal is available, I know he's going to be 33, but you would like to bring back a guy who registered almost 10 sacks for you this past year. So all of those guys, I think, would make a lot of sense if you can bring them back as depth pieces. They're not going to be top priorities in free agency, but you've seen what they can do, and they fit into this scheme perfectly.
Yeah, and as for how they fit within the larger salary cap ramifications, when I initially put up our story on how the planning could work, I made the grave mistake of assuming that the total value of 4 or 5 of those guys resigning would have been like $8 million. So that's $8 million against the cap, but that's not the case, because with the rule of 51, which basically says that from the start of the league year till I think the first week of free agency, only the 51 biggest deals on a team's ledger count against the salary cap. And that means that like there are guys right now who are making very, very little who, are counting against that salary cap. So you take them out and you replace them with like a $1.5 million salary, let's say for a $1.5 million deal for Brent Urban. That means that it's not, $1.5 million added to the cap. It's like $600,000 or $700,000. So that helps with kind of thinking bigger picture of, okay, signing Brent Urban, Malik Harrison, Delshon Phillips, Ronald Darby, Daryl Worley might count $8 million in total when you just add up all of those 1-year deals. But really, it might only count for $4 million against the cap just because of the relative give and take with, guys coming off and coming on that Rule of 51 calculation.
Then we turn our attention to the NFL draft in late April. And I think we both have the top priority for the Ravens, or at least one of the top priorities, being drafting along the line, offensive or defensive lines. I think that's solid practice for any franchise. But right now for the Ravens, I know they're going to take the best player available, as they say. However, this is a team that long term is going to need to find replacements for their left and right offensive tackle. They're going to need to find replacements for Jadeveon Clowney, maybe Kyle Van Noy on the edges, and Odafe Owe. They whether or not they pick up his 5th-year option, he's only under contract for 1 or 2 more seasons. They may have to find a replacement for David Ojabo, who has not been available and on the field enough for them this past year. So I have them prioritizing the offensive or defensive line early, because that is really the best bet to get a franchise guy. Offensive line, especially, and edge rushers, those are positions that go higher in the draft and they get pushed up the board just like quarterbacks do, which means if, the value of a 4th-round running back is like much higher, that's a much better player than the value of a 4th-round offensive tackle, because the talent gets pushed up the board at those type of positions. So whether it's the 30th overall pick, whether it's their 2nd-round pick, I think they absolutely need to address either offensive or defensive line in early in the 2024 draft.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting to listen to Dane Brugler from The Athletic, who does a great job with covering the draft, covering prospects. Talking in his podcast recap of the combine from this past week, the fall off from the top tackles in this draft to the top wide receivers in this draft is significant. That doesn't mean that the Ravens have to wait, have to make a pick at pick 30 or have to trade up to get a potential plug and play guard who could maybe, slide the tackle next year or 2 years from now. But I think it does put a greater emphasis on the fact that if you want, like you said, Paul, premium talent that is not that, meets a certain athletic threshold for what it takes to be a really good player in this league, you should probably look to either tackle or edge rusher. I guess we have to kind of define exactly, whether someone like Darius Robinson would be an edge rusher because of, what he did athletically and the way that he lines up and all that stuff. But I think you can find, if you are a good talent scout, a capable receiver in the 2nd or 3rd or 4th round. I know there are a lot of teams who will probably be heading into this draft prioritizing different things after what we saw from Puka Nacua, after what we've seen just across the league with the kind of advent of, GPS data that tells you that a player can move fast, even if that 40-yard dash is not 4.35 seconds. So I think if I'm the Ravens, I'm drafting either a tackle or an edge rusher somewhere in that top 50, because I think that's the sweet spot for finding guys who can help you significantly and especially early.
You mentioned Darius Robinson from Mizzou. I mean, guys who could fit this bill. Chop Robinson, he's gotten a lot of love on this podcast. The Penn State defensive end, Georgia offensive tackle, Amarius Mims, we've mentioned him. A lot of guys could fit into that category. Beyond the first couple picks, I think other positions that need to be addressed in this draft, and we didn't talk about them adding. We talked about the Ravens subtracting at wide receiver and losing OBJ, designating him as a post June 1 release, that means you're losing some talent at wide receiver. They need to target wide receiver. Maybe it is that first round pick. Maybe it's second or third, but I don't think they can wait until day 3 of the draft to address wide receiver as deep as this class is. I mean, Keon Coleman, we've mentioned, the Florida State wide receiver, Adonai Mitchell from Texas, Troy Franklin from Oregon. These are guys that could fit in the second round potentially. And then third, fourth round, I think you need to address running back. Maybe it's not, maybe you wait until the fourth round to get early day 3 to try to draft somebody. But whether it's Tony Pollard or Dante Foreman or somebody else, they're likely only going to sign a stopgap running back in free agency. And that's okay. But if you can get a good, high upside running back in this draft, then you're talking about 2025 and beyond having Keaton Mitchell and another guy as your 1-2 punch in the backfield going forward. And you don't even need to touch that position in, next free agency or going forward in 2026 and beyond. So I would like them to address that position as well.
Yeah, I think we're aligned in that there should be a wide receiver taken by the end of day 2. And to follow up on that, I would probably add, if it fits within the best player available parameters of the Ravens, kind of strive to live by, then try to make him an X receiver. Keon Coleman obviously is a name that is on the lips of a lot of Ravens fans, but there are a lot of big, strong, decently fast guys who could be that X receiver. I don't know necessarily if, I'm curious to see like how adding the guy, especially if it's a first rounder, to be your X receiver changes Lamar, because we've talked about this before. We'll talk about it again as the draft comes closer. Is he a guy who is comfortable throwing those 50-50 balls, throwing those back shoulder fades that he has just not really thrown? Like when he's throwing back shoulder fades, it is typically to guys running slot fades, so he has that more space to kind of throw to, near the sideline, but it's not really the Mike Evans type throws that he kind of just out muscles dudes from. So, we've seen the Ravens ask Lamar to do different things because they feel like he's ready for that next step in his evolution. So I think if you get an X receiver who's big and strong and, hopefully a lot better than Miles Boykin was when he was in Baltimore, that pushes Lamar to another level of his game. But it would also free Rashad Bateman to not be the X receiver, because if indeed Lamar just doesn't like throwing those, typical X receiver routes, then put Rashad Bateman in a spot where he can produce better and he gets more looks from Lamar wherever he's lined up.
And it is a long-term need for the team because Rashad Bateman is most likely going to be on an expiring contract unless the Ravens surprisingly pick up his 5th-year option. All right. And then the final thing, let's make this quick, is the quarterback position, I think, should be addressed on day 3, rounds 5 through 7, maybe round 4, because you need a cheap backup for Lamar. You could address it via free agency. You could try to get like a Marcus Mariota or somebody of that ilk. But we saw the Ravens do it in the past with Tyler Huntley, and they could do it again here. They have Malik Cunningham at least as their QB3, but with Lamar's injury history, you need somebody who is ready to play. There are some projects that I think could be taken in rounds 5 through 7. Michael Pratt from Tulane, Joe Milton III from Tennessee, Sam Hartman from Notre Dame. Take one of these guys, develop him, hope that he's not pressed into action too early, and have him battled with Malik Cunningham for that QB2 spot.
Yeah, we're just 2 years removed at this point from Lamar being in his second year of being really banged up and not being able to finish a season. So we don't know what the Ravens have with Malik Cunningham. The Ravens thought, what we know how the Ravens thought of Malik Cunningham is that they were still giving him special teams reps, toward the end of last season. So I don't know. I wouldn't say that's not an endorsement, but it's just an interesting thing to consider as we move forward. Elsewhere in day 3, I think you can get good value with a potential blocking tight end. Find someone who could be that Patrick Ricard replacement. Look for cornerbacks. Brandon Stevens is entering the final year of his deal. We don't know how Marlon Humphrey's health is going to hold up long term, and then obviously running back. If day 3 is indeed the spot to look for running backs, hopefully they have the means and the board that falls their way in the fourth round, where you can get your pick of a nice few guys, whether it's a speedster, whether it's more of a mauler, like a Gus Edwards type. But I just think, the best player available philosophy really works when you have a lot of day 3 picks. And even if the draft might not be as deep as it has been in years past because of NIL and everything, I do think that there are certain specific niche roles that the Ravens could fill if they, do their job well in the draft on day 3 this year.
So those are our offseason plans for the Baltimore Ravens, and we hope Eric DeCosta was taking notes, because now he has a perfect plan laid out for him. Didn't need to do any work during this offseason. Let us know what you think of our plans. Give us a like, a thumbs up, a subscribe, a comment, a review. We will read out some reviews here on the podcast if you let us know what you think on Apple Podcasts or anywhere that you get your podcasts. Follow Jonas at Jonas_Shaffer. I am at Paul Mancano and at All Banner Sports. Thanks so much for tuning in. We will be back hopefully later this week with maybe a little free agency exercise, as teams can start negotiating with players on other teams beginning this Monday. Thanks so much for tuning in. For Jonas Shaffer